The official record on the hiker who vanished in 2010 was thin, another name lost to the wilderness. Her car was found at a trailhead in Grand Teton, locked, undisturbed. The accepted theory was accident or misadventure, and for 2 years the mountains kept their silence. Then, in 2012, an anthropologist searching a remote gorge uncovered scraps of fabric, a broken watch, and an imitation tribal amulet wedged in stone. What looked like ritual was in fact revenge, and the organization behind it wasn't the wilderness, but something far more human, someone who had been waiting years to strike. Laya Serrano was 31 when she vanished into the wilderness of Wyoming's Grand Teton National Park in the summer of 2010. On paper, she was the image of success, a trained psychologist who had chosen a career in graphic design, known for her striking looks, sharp intellect, and a social presence that seemed to demand attention wherever she went. But beneath that polished surface, whispers followed her. Old friends from her university days remembered her differently, not as a dedicated student, but as a woman who treated relationships like stepping stones, pursuing wealthy or ambitious men, extracting gifts or money, and then slipping away as quickly as she had appeared. Some called her a playgirl, others described her as calculating, but all agreed she left behind more broken hearts than lasting connections. None of that was in the headlines when she disappeared. The official story began on a warm July afternoon when Laya failed to return from a solo hike near Jenny Lake. Her rental car was found parked neatly in the trailhead lot, locked, with a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. Rangers scoured the area, their search dogs straining against leashes, helicopters circling over jagged ridgelines. For days, teams of volunteers combed through meadows and creeks, calling her name into the silence of the park. No footprints, no discarded gear, no trace of struggle, only the vehicle remained, as if she had stepped into the forest and dissolved. The media descended quickly, captivated by the image of a young professional swallowed by the American wilderness. Headlines framed her as a vibrant designer, a woman with a bright future cruelly cut short by nature's indifference. Photographs of her smiling face, framed by windswept hair, splashed across national broadcasts. Interviews with colleagues painted her as ambitious and creative, while her family pleaded for answers, their voices trembling through press conferences. Yet for all this sympathy, darker currents ran beneath the surface. Detectives quietly noted the lack of hiking gear in her car. No tent, no heavy pack, not even sturdy boots. It was as if the hike had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, or perhaps not a hike at all. When investigators reached out to her past acquaintances, a different Laya began to emerge. Former boyfriends described a pattern: whirlwind romance, rapid intimacy, sudden requests for money, and then silence. One man claimed he had lost nearly $10,000 during their brief relationship. Another confessed he had been so devastated when she left that he dropped out of law school. These stories were not publicized, but they seeded suspicion within the investigation. Was Laya truly a victim of the park's unforgiving landscape, or had her past finally caught up with her? By the second week, the search dwindled. Resources were pulled, volunteers went home, and the forest returned to its stillness. Officially, Laya Serrano was declared missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, whispers lingered that perhaps someone had lured her into the wilderness, someone who knew her habits, someone who had waited years for revenge. At the time, it was only speculation, a rumor traded among those who remembered her not as a victim, but as a manipulator. Yet that speculation would grow, especially 2 years later, when a tribal amulet was discovered in a remote gorge, an object that suggested her disappearance was not an accident of nature, but the result of a carefully orchestrated act of vengeance. In the weeks following Laya Serrano's disappearance, the official search shifted from an urgent rescue mission to the slower, more methodical pace of an investigation.
Detectives who had initially assumed a tragic hiking accident began to dig deeper into her personal life, prompted by subtle inconsistencies that surfaced in interviews. Leela's family described her as ambitious, private, and fiercely independent, but when pressed, her younger cousin admitted she was complicated. She could charm you one minute and cut you down the next. It was the ex-boyfriends, however, who offered the most troubling accounts. One after another, they painted a picture of a woman who used affection like a weapon, wielding her intelligence and beauty to draw men into her orbit before abandoning them once they had served their purpose. A banker in Chicago recalled how she had convinced him to invest in her design startup, only to disappear weeks later, leaving him tens of thousands of dollars in debt. A former medical student from Denver remembered her as intoxicating and destructive, recounting nights filled with passion and mornings filled with unexplained withdrawals from his bank account. The pattern was chillingly consistent: a whirlwind romance, sudden financial strain, and an abrupt vanishing act. What startled investigators most was the number of men who spoke about her with a mixture of bitterness and admiration. "She was brilliant," said one, "but she knew how to make you believe you were the only man in the world. And then, just like that, she was gone." Another confessed he had considered taking his own life after she left him financially ruined. To detectives, these weren't just stories of heartbreak. They were potential motives. If even half of what these men alleged was true, Leela had left behind a trail of resentment deep enough to inspire violence. Among the voices that rose above the rest was that of Adrian Cole. Once a promising anthropology student at Stanford, Adrian had been one of Leela's longest entanglements, dating back nearly a decade. At first, he was reluctant to speak, responding to police inquiries with short, clipped answers. But when reporters began to sensationalize Leela's disappearance, Adrian made a cryptic post on an old university message board. "She played with fire for years. Maybe the fire found her." Investigators took note. When questioned again, he described their relationship as intoxicating but toxic. He had this way of making you feel like you owed her everything. She'd push you to your limits, and when you're at your weakest, she'd take what she wanted and vanish. "She left me with nothing. No money, no reputation, no degree. I was supposed to become an anthropologist. Instead, I became a ghost of myself." His bitterness was palpable, his words edged with an anger that hadn't dulled with time. Detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Adrian, or someone like him, had orchestrated a kind of poetic justice, using Leela's own history of betrayal as justification for revenge. Yet there was no hard evidence linking him to her disappearance, only suspicion and the shadows of old wounds. Meanwhile, her family and colleagues pushed back against these darker portrayals. Her mother insisted Leela was misunderstood, a woman who had struggled to find her place in the world after leaving psychology for design. Friends from her office described her as driven and creative, someone who stayed late into the night sketching logos and layouts. "She was finally building something real," one coworker said. "She wouldn't just walk away from it all." The investigation stalled in this tension between two versions of Leela Serrano, the accomplished designer and the manipulative con artist. Which one had vanished in Grand Teton, and which version of her story had finally invited danger into her life? As the case went cold, it seemed the truth might never surface. But in 2012, a discovery in the mountains would reignite the mystery, reframing Leela's disappearance not as a tragic accident, but the chilling result of a long simmering vendetta.
2 years after Leela Serrano disappeared into the Grand Teton wilderness, the case was all but forgotten. Her family, drained by vigils and interviews, had gone silent. Her colleagues moved on. Even her most bitter ex-lovers had stopped making cryptic remarks online. The park itself had swallowed her whole, becoming the silent keeper of her secret. Then, in late August 2012, the mountains gave something back. Dr. Naomi Flint, a cultural anthropologist from Montana State University, had been conducting field research on indigenous artifacts within the Grand Teton region. It was an assignment she described as routine, mapping, cataloging, and photographing objects near remote trails. On a humid afternoon, while hiking along an overgrown gorge far from the tourist paths, she noticed a flash of metal wedged between two rocks at the base of a cliff. At first, she thought it was discarded jewelry, but when she pried it free, she realized she was holding an intricately crafted amulet. Roughly circular, carved from bone and wrapped with copper wire, it bore etchings resembling tribal patterns, spirals and angular lines meant to evoke protection or warning. What unsettled her most was its condition. Unlike the weather-worn stones and ancient beads she'd typically studied, this object looked fresh, as though it had been made only years, not centuries, earlier. Naomi logged its location and brought it back to her temporary lab, assuming she had discovered a unique cultural relic. But the deeper she dug, the stranger it became. The design didn't match the symbolic language of any local tribe in the Tetons, nor did it resemble the motifs of neighboring Shoshone or Crow peoples. Colleagues confirmed her suspicion. The amulet was not authentic. It was at best a crude imitation, a modern creation designed to look tribal. That revelation unsettled her. Why would something like this be buried in a remote gorge? The answer came days later when park rangers, alerted by Naomi's find, searched the area more thoroughly. Rough scraps of synthetic fabric, faded, shredded, but still recognizable, were discovered caught in branches along the cliffside. Forensic testing identified the material as belonging to an REI hiking jacket, the exact model Lila Serrano had purchased before her trip in 2010. Alongside the fabric, they found a cracked wristwatch with the initials LS scratched faintly into the back. Suddenly, what had been a cultural oddity became potential evidence in a missing persons case. When the results were announced, media swarmed once more. "Hiker's fate tied to mysterious amulet," one headline blared. Lila's family clung to the hope that the discoveries would finally bring closure. Investigators, however, saw something far darker. If the amulet was deliberately planted, it suggested intent. Someone wanted Lila's disappearance to resemble something ritualistic, something beyond an accident. The gorge where the items were found was steep and treacherous, nearly impossible to reach without deliberate effort. To detectives, this meant two things. Lila had not wandered there by chance, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage the scene. Attention soon turned back to the shadow that had loomed over the case since the beginning: Adrian Cole. The former anthropology student's history made him uniquely suspicious. He had once studied symbolic artifacts in his graduate program, and his academic records revealed a thesis proposal on the intersection of ritual and deception in modern contexts. Detectives quietly noted how his research mirrored the amulet's placement, a fake ritual object used to send a message. Adrian, when asked, denied ever being near Grand Teton in 2010, claiming he hadn't traveled to Wyoming in years. But when pressed about the amulet, his voice betrayed him. "It's not authentic," he said flatly, before investigators had even revealed that detail publicly. How could he have known? The revelation fractured public opinion. To some, Adrian was the obvious culprit, a man humiliated and ruined by Lila, who had orchestrated her disappearance as revenge, leaving behind a calling card only he could fully appreciate. To others, he was being scapegoated, his bitterness towards Lila misinterpreted as guilt. Internet forums buzzed with conspiracy theories that the amulet was a hoax, planted by someone else, that Lila herself had staged her disappearance, using her knowledge of psychology to manipulate the narrative, that the entire case was a tangled web of deceit, stretching back to her university years. For investigators, the amulet was a pivot point. It transformed the story from a tragic accident into something intentional, deliberate, and sinister.
The wilderness had not claimed Leela by chance. Someone had claimed her as part of a design, one that blended personal vendetta with symbolic theater. Still, without a body, without witnesses, the amulet remained a haunting clue rather than proof. Prosecutors knew that unless more evidence surfaced, Adrian could not be charged. He was free, but now he was no longer invisible. Every move he made was shadowed by suspicion. The discovery also rekindled tension within Leela's family. Her mother dismissed the artifact as a distraction, insisting her daughter had likely fallen and perished, her belongings carried by water into the gorge. But her cousin, who had once called Leela complicated, told a reporter, "If someone left that thing out there, it means they hated her enough to make a show of it. And I can think of more than one person who hated her that much." The stage was set. The amulet, crude and mysterious, was not just a relic of the wilderness. It was the first real thread in unraveling the darker truth of what had happened in 2010. And with its discovery, investigators were about to pull on that thread until the entire story of betrayal, obsession, and revenge began to unravel.
The amulet had changed everything. Once dismissed as a tragic accident in the wilderness, Leela Serrano's case was now framed as something far darker, a disappearance steeped in symbolism and intention. Detectives doubled down on their scrutiny of Adrian Cole, the ex-lover who seemed to hover over the investigation like a specter. His bitterness was no longer dismissed as the ramblings of a man scorned. It was now potential motive, sharpened by the unsettling coincidence of his academic background in anthropology and ritual studies. Financial records provided the first crack in his carefully maintained alibi. While reviewing Leela's bank statements, investigators discovered a series of unusual transfers in the days leading up to her disappearance. Thousands of dollars were siphoned off her accounts, routed through layers of shell corporations, before surfacing in a dormant account linked to Adrian's old university email. Though the paper trail was obscured, the timing was damning. It appeared that Adrian had been systematically draining her finances, perhaps as part of a long-planned revenge. To the detectives, this suggested not a crime of passion, but a calculated act. When confronted with this evidence, Adrian's composure faltered. In a tense interview, he shifted between denial and cryptic insinuations. She built her life on lies. She took pieces of people, chewed them up, spat them out, and you all applauded her for it. When pressed, he offered a chilling line that prosecutors would later repeat in court. "She took pieces of us. I just took a piece back." The implication was unmistakable. Adrian saw his actions not as murder, but as restitution, a twisted form of balance. Still, the absence of a body left the case fragile. Prosecutors knew juries were hesitant without physical remains, yet the amulet itself, paired with the financial evidence, painted a narrative too compelling to ignore. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence. Adrian had re-entered Leela's life under the guise of reconciliation, luring her into the Tetons with the promise of a private retreat. Once isolated, he staged the hike, guiding her toward the gorge where he ambushed her. The amulet, a crude symbol of ritual, was planted to transform the crime into a message, a final gesture of control, the kind of theatrical flourish that Adrian had once studied academically. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors depicted Adrian as a man consumed by humiliation, whose academic ambitions had been destroyed by Leela's manipulations. The amulet became the centerpiece of their case, not as an authentic artifact, but as a symbol of Adrian's warped sense of justice. They argued he wanted the world to see Leela not as a victim, but as a predator who had finally met her predator.
The defense, in turn, tried to dismantle Leela's reputation, painting her as a manipulator who left enemies in her wake. They suggested Adrian was merely another casualty of her lifestyle, not her killer. Without a body, the defense argued, everything else was conjecture. But Adrian could not contain his own pride. Under cross-examination, he slipped into philosophical musings about morality, justice, and ritual, statements that prosecutors seized upon as near confessions. At one point, when asked directly whether he had orchestrated her disappearance, he smirked and replied, "Disappearance is just another word for transformation." The courtroom fell silent. For many jurors, that single line was the moment the case was decided. By the trial's end, Adrian Cole was convicted, though only of second-degree murder, given the lack of a body. For the families, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served in name, but closure remained elusive. Leela's remains were never recovered, leaving open a haunting possibility that somewhere in the Tetons, she still lay hidden, her final resting place marked only by the crude amulet of a man who believed vengeance was an art form.
The conviction of Adrian Cole should have brought an end to the saga of Leela Serrano, but instead, it opened a new chapter filled with uncertainty and unease. On paper, justice had been served. Adrian was sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder, a sentence reflecting the jury's belief that he had lured Leela into the Tetons and orchestrated her disappearance. But without a body, without the final, tangible proof of her death, the case never felt finished. The verdict was a legal conclusion, not an emotional one. For many, it was as though a curtain had fallen over an unfinished play, leaving the audience unsettled rather than satisfied. Leela's family remained divided. Her mother, who had long rejected the darker portrayals of her daughter, wept openly in court, clutching photographs of a smiling, ambitious designer. To her, Adrian was nothing more than a jealous monster who had snuffed out a bright future. But other relatives, those who had seen the manipulative side of Leela up close, were less certain. One cousin told a reporter, "She wasn't an angel. She hurt people. And in some twisted way, maybe that came back to her." That statement sparked controversy, fueling endless debates online about victimhood, culpability, and the blurred lines between predator and prey. True crime media pounced on the contradictions. Documentaries and podcasts framed the saga as the Amulet case, elevating the crude object found in the gorge into a symbol of the entire mystery. Some productions leaned into the theatrical, depicting the amulet as a talisman of vengeance, a sign that Adrian saw himself as judge and executioner. Others suggested the amulet was nothing more than a red herring, a planted distraction to complicate the investigation. The fact that it was never conclusively tied to Adrian, no fingerprints, no DNA, only deepened the speculation. Meanwhile, Adrian himself became a figure of fascination. In prison interviews, he oscillated between denial and justification, speaking in riddles that blurred the line between confession and philosophy. "Justice is a story," he once told a journalist, "and stories depend on who tells them. In mine, I didn't kill her. I freed her from the game she was playing." His cryptic remarks only fueled the public's obsession, transforming him into a macabre anti-hero in certain corners of the internet. Some even argued he had exposed a kind of poetic justice, punishing the manipulator with her own tactics of deceit and abandonment. But for investigators, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. Without Leela's remains, they could not confirm how she had died, or even if Adrian's version of events was fully accurate. Rumors persisted that he had accomplices, perhaps other ex-lovers who shared his bitterness.
Some whispered that Leela might have faked her own death, planting the amulet herself to frame Adrian, a theory unsupported by evidence but irresistible to those who viewed her as the ultimate trickster. Each unanswered question became fuel for speculation, keeping the case alive in the public imagination long after the courtroom lights dimmed. The park itself became part of the story. Tourists who hiked near Ginny Lake spoke of the eerie atmosphere, of seeing makeshift shrines where people left trinkets and notes addressed to Leela. Rangers grew weary of outsiders sneaking into restricted areas of the gorge, hoping to glimpse the place where the amulet was found. The Tetons, once a backdrop for Leela's disappearance, became a stage for the mythology that followed. In the end, the true legacy of the case was not closure, but ambiguity. Leela Serrano's life was reframed not by her achievements in design, but by the contradictions of her character. To some, a brilliant, independent woman. To others, a manipulative opportunist. Adrian Cole, likewise, was seen not only as a murderer, but as a man who allowed bitterness to consume him until revenge became his only identity. Together, their story blurred the boundaries between love, betrayal, and vengeance, creating a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond Wyoming. The amulet itself remains locked in an evidence vault, sealed in a plastic bag, its carved spirals dulled by time. For detectives who worked the case, it's a haunting reminder of the questions that still hang over the story. Who truly crafted it? Was it a symbol of Adrian's revenge, or an artifact of deception by someone else entirely? And most haunting of all, does Leela Serrano's body still lie somewhere in the mountains, waiting for the wilderness to yield its final secret? The case may be closed in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public memory, it endures as a story without an ending, a mystery knotted in revenge, deception, and the silent vastness of the Tetons.